justice for all.
For the Planning Commission portion of the meeting, the first item on the agenda is our adoption of the agenda. A motion to adopt. Thank you, Mr. Atkins. Do I have a second? Thank you, Mr. Sisk. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? That takes us to the adoption of the minutes from October 18th, 2023. Does anyone have any changes or a motion to adopt these minutes as presented? Oh, I should note for the record that we do have people joining us via Zoom this evening. Is that correct, Mr. Curry?
Yes,
For the Planning Commission.
Commissioner Ritter is joining, I believe, for medical reasons from home. Is that correct, Ms. Ritter?
That's right, that's correct. Can you hear me?
Oh,
Yes.
yeah.
Even better than if you were in person. So that takes us back to the adoption of the minutes, if anyone has any changes or a motion on that.
Planning Commission minutes.
Do you want a motion?
Yes, please.
Make a motion to approve.
Thank you. I'll have a second.
I'll second.
Thank you. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, we have no public hearing scheduled for tonight. That takes us on to public comment.
Let's have Ms. Donahue bring the board in, reconvene them. Not really, didn't mix them together very well, but we definitely need the board to reconvene.
Okay. At this time, I'd like to reconvene the Board of Supervisors regular meeting that was begun on November 6th.
6 and continue to tonight.
Continue to tonight.
Mr. Frazier might join us electronically at some point in time. I'll keep an eye on that. He's not with us right now.
But we have 4
Yeah.
or 5.
And if you want to adopt the board agenda, which is essentially the same.
I'll motion to adopt our board supervisors agenda.
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right.
All right. Thank you. Now back to the Planning Commission.
All right, that takes us to public comment. Anyone that wishes to speak is welcome to stand and address your comments to the Commission and Board of Supervisors. If you'd like to speak, this is your opportunity to do so. Yes, sir.
Ron Aglove, and I'll look after you, Chairman of the BCA. First off, I'd like to make a comment about the first thing you're going to talk about, which is tourist homes and the changes in the ordinance. And I'm a little concerned in that the BZA, going back in history, I mean, we were issuing the permits for years. And now it's time to make some necessary changes, particularly in the short-term rental area. But the BZA has not been consulted, asked. We have a history. We know the problems. We've dealt with them. We have, some years ago, sent requests to the Board of Supervisors for assistance, particularly in the short-term rental area, and that we were seeing problems there that we couldn't address, that we felt needed to be dealt with. So now it's time to make those changes, but apparently the history and the comments of the members of the BZA are not important, and I'm concerned about that. And then just making some comments on the proposed changes. Basically going to right down to number 9 here, the zoning administrator shall not accept special exception applications for tourist homes or bed and breakfasts unless the application or owner has owned the parcel for a period not less than 2 years. That's a good idea on properties that are being initially purchased. I mean, of a property that is not already a short-term rental. So, because we ran into that and were concerned about it last year, in that we had a couple of applications where it was very obvious that people had come in, bought a property with specific intent of turning it into a short-term rental. And we weren't comfortable with that. But at the same time, to make the ownership 2 years before you can apply, if you buy a piece of property, we've got history of those properties in that there have been permits issued for properties, short-term rentals, tourist homes, whatever, that had no caveat as far as sale of the property. So those, and I'm not sure how many of them are still active or whatever, that's something we need to determine, how many of those are actually exist. Because I don't think you can go in and make an ordinance that says suddenly that people that sell that property to someone else, that the person that buys it doesn't get it, because when they got that permit, there was no limit on it. And then recently, we have, in issuing the permits, put a caveat on there that they went with the current owner, and that the next owner was going to have to apply to continue it. But with the way you've written it in the ordinance now, that person would have to wait 2 years, which for the person that owns that property and is selling it, that affects the value of the property. And the owner that got the permit shouldn't have to suffer and not be able to take advantage of that anymore. So I think in doing what we want to do, which we need to do, we've got to slow it down a little bit and look at how we handle each one of these individual areas. And also, going farther down in there as far as inspections, and also you have made mention of an annual permit, which I think is a good idea. You have to re-register every year, whatever. But that way, you can keep track of which properties are still actively being used under that permit. And another thing that we don't do in the county, and we've tried to do it, and it's in the ordinance, is that you have to have smoke detectors and fire extinguishers and all this. But once the permit is issued, we don't have anything in there that allows us to ascertain whether in fact that is being continued. So I think we need to put that into the ordinance in the way of an annual inspection, and if there are costs to the county involving that, that becomes part of this annual not reissuing of the permit, but just the fee you pay on an annual basis. It's kind of like if you're an LLC and you've got your permit, it costs you $50 every year just to file that, and that's something you just pay as part of the cost of business. So basically what I'm suggesting is that we need to realize that we're making a good move here as far as particularly the 2-year on a new permit. But we've got to look at the old permits, and also let's strengthen it as far as some safety standards, and that let's make this annual inspection, it has to do with fire, it has to do with public safety or whatever, and include that in the ordinance. Most other areas have these kinds of things in their ordinance, and it's time for us to sort of step up and get into that group. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ron.
Anyone else that wishes to speak? Now's your opportunity.
Mary Catherine. So thank you for taking up the Torstone matter tonight. I also think that's important, so appreciate you guys taking that on and being proactive about it. And I also want to thank the Berkeley group for the hard work they've done on the revamping the zoning ordinance. There's clearly been a ton of work put into that, and that's what I'd like to speak to tonight. As structured, though, the proposed revamping of the entire zoning ordinance is a massive undertaking. Looking through the documents proposed for tonight's meeting, it's very difficult for county residents, such as myself, for the Planning Commission, I believe, as well as for the board, to absorb the volume of material or to be able to focus on individual provisions. I believe I counted 13 separate documents attached to the agenda for tonight on board docs, although it was a little hard to tell because there were duplications buried within the various agenda items. But these include whole rewritten sections of our ordinance, detailed Excel spreadsheets, complicated crosswalk documents, and various levels of overview materials and meeting summaries. It does not include the additional 4 detailed red line drafts that were not included on board docs but were provided by the Berkeley group. It's important to not make this such an overwhelming and confusing task that important matters get lost, overlooked, or misunderstood. One need only to look at the massive federal budget process to understand how things can get inserted into large legislative packages and be easily missed. We don't want things to get inserted intentionally or otherwise into our zoning or subdivision ordinances without a full understanding of their impact and full public transparency. To try to reorganize and renumber the entire zoning ordinance, plus attempt to simplify standards throughout the ordinance, plus to address the restructuring of various provisions throughout, plus propose numerous other substantive policy changes that have been raised at various times but never addressed, plus make needed changes to comply with current provisions of the Virginia Code, is far, far too much to accomplish at once with any kind of rational control and understanding. Instead, we should prioritize making changes required by the Virginia Code as a first manageable step. Reviewing the materials provided, it's difficult to impossible to pull out which provisions have been changed strictly to comply with the Code of Virginia. The Board of Planning Commission should ask the Berkeley group to have a first draft for review and public hearing that addresses only those changes needed to comply with current state law. As they are required by state law, making those changes should be relatively straightforward and then can clear the way for making further policy changes after that. There are a number of very urgent, very critical issues for which we are either not in compliance currently with the state code or are not taking advantage of current standards. Some of those include our telecom provisions, our rules on conditional proffers for zoning, and solar energy provisions. We should also be taking a very close look at any existing state standards for data centers, which are popular everywhere. The Berkeley group hopefully can address these and other important state code provisions. Once that's completed, we should turn our attention to high priority policy matters, such as any critical updates to our subdivision ordinance and addressing development threats such as the data centers. And after that, finally, reorganizing and restructuring can occur as a clean and understandable separate step. As was seen with the sign ordinance, presenting our citizens with a highly technical, complex set of changes in a single overwhelming package only results ultimately in delays and frustration. Changes to our county zoning provisions can be risky under the best of circumstances. Creating a massive set of changes at once, as is currently being suggested, courts disaster. Please address this process carefully, thoughtfully, and in manageable pieces, and with ample opportunity along the way for public information and involvement. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else that would like to speak? There is your opportunity.
My name is Karen. I'm in Jackson District, and I'll just say briefly that Ron Mackler made some very good points that I hadn't fully considered. I do support that we need to do something with the tourist home permits. And so I like the 2-year idea, but he's raised some issues that I think bear consideration. And then to Mary Catherine Ishii's point, I am just starting to get through finalizing the second of the red line drafts of the Berkeley group. And I'm going to need to go through it several times to sort of digest what they've changed and what is just a word change or something else. There are some very significant substantive changes, and again, that I noticed in just 1 and 2, primarily in 2 right now. And I haven't even got through 3 and 9. So I think Mary Catherine Ishii's suggestion of looking at, hey, let's just do what may be word cleanup and requirements to comply with state code, and then look back, because I do recall back to a planning commission session with the Berkeley group presentation where there was some discussion about your directive was not to really be making a lot of significant changes in terms of who handles what. It was more clean this up and make it a more cohesive thing. But there are, right now, as I can tell, and I will have a better draft of my thoughts to you when I complete everything and run through it a few more times, there are significant changes in who's handling what, and some word changes there that give me pause for consideration. One of them that I just noticed is how affected properties are notified when a special exception permit is being considered. And so I think that we need to kind of take a breath here and look at it, because it is a massive undertaking. And I'm not an expert, but I usually have a sense for that, and my head's spinning. So I think we all should be pretty thoughtful there, because this is something we don't want to have to repeat, and we certainly don't want to miss something and then have it come back around to bite us and find out that, that was something we should have looked at before, find out the hard way. So, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else? All right. If there's no one else that wishes to speak, we'll go ahead and close the public comment, which takes us to the meeting of the Board of Supervisors on tourist home special requirements. And it's such a pleasure of the board, I think, how we wish to work through this agenda item.
I'm happy to kind of start, unless Gary, you had something you wanted to say. Since this was something that I had brought up at a Board of Supervisors meeting, I watched the Planning Commission meeting where you guys talked about this last month. And so I guess I figured I'd just kind of answer some questions that I heard. This is something that it just occurred to me a couple months ago after kind of thinking through what I've been hearing from the community regarding basically what's going on nationwide with kind of the, tourist homes in general and the effect that they're having on localities. The way that I'm looking at it is not a fix for affordable housing. It's not something that is meant to just kind of be an off-the-cuff, hey, let's see if this works type thing. What it really is meant to do is it's meant to give our people that have grown up here maybe an edge or a shot at getting a house. Now what are we looking at? We're looking at houses that have 10 acres or more. We're not talking about houses that are $195,000. That's not what's going on. We're looking at houses maybe some under $500,000. And I come across a lot of folks in the line of work that I do at the brewery who talk to me about buying investment properties here, and who do. And I think that's great. And I want to say first and foremost that I think that tourist homes are a benefit to our community, and they generate a significant amount of tax dollars for us, and it is worthwhile. What this would be a way of hopefully giving that 1 or 2, maybe 3 families per year, per 2 years, a shot. People who want to live here. That's the first thing. The second thing, and I'm not saying this is a foregone conclusion, but the second thing is there's nothing stopping a very big hospitality group from coming in, buying up 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 contiguous lots that all satisfy the zoning requirements, quote unquote, getting them all together and then coming at us and saying, hey, I want 8 tourist homes. And then we're gonna be sitting there going like, huh, we just did one over the summer where we did 5 in one. And that was a lot, I felt. Then when that hospitality group has 8, they come to us 4 years later and say, I want an event center. It makes sense, we've got all these people staying. That could work in our county, but I feel like we need to have a bigger conversation about that if we're doing that. Tourist homes are a rezoning of agricultural land and their commercial businesses. Again, I just want to repeat that I am supportive of them and I think that they help our community. My thinking here was that if we did something like 2 years, maybe as a, and there's 2 ways of doing this. We could add it as a condition or we could do an ordinance change. So we could go maybe 2 ways of doing it, maybe. But one way we could think about it is that, and this is Ms. Smith's idea, is that you could simply waive this requirement if it was going to be a primary residence. If somebody was going to come in and they were going to buy it, perhaps they were going to be out of the country for or wherever for 3 months, you could say, hey, we're going to waive that requirement. It might also be possible to work in there if somebody's purchasing a home that's been a tourist home, that maybe perhaps, I don't know, I haven't thought this through and I don't know the ins and outs of it, if that could be a requirement that's waived too, to not have the value of the property lost to Mr. McAuliffe point. But a lot of these homes, or a lot of these permits that we've gotten all have sunset clauses on them, or not sunset clauses, but the permit will terminate on sale of the property. Now, because it has a history of being a successful Airbnb, gives the next buyer a signal that they, I don't want to say should, but have a likely opportunity to do it as well. But it's not guaranteed. Anyway, that's the backstory of where this came from. It was an idea that I had to just throw at the Planning Commission to see if you guys wanted to consider it and throw and debate the merits of that.
And we'll just introduce the data that's on the screen, which is the table printed out here. It's on Board Docs. So this, Michelle compiled the tourist home SUPs or SEs that have been applied for since she's been here, which is just before 2017.
Right.
And the rows that are highlighted, what looks like a gold color on the screen, those were applied for within 2 years of the home being purchased. So 2 years just selected based on the proposed language. So those, would be delayed or something if this language was put in place. She and Ms. Graham have also been working on, but it wasn't fully parsed yet, the complete list from the 70s, I think it was. Yes. Of all tourist homes that have been applied for, approved, denied, withdrawn, and those that cross-check of every available piece of information are active. And it looks like we're around 70 or so active. And this cross-reference has brought a couple to light to Ms. Graham that she's going to go look at. And I don't think there's any surprises for Michelle on the zoning compliance side. I think there were 2 that you already had on sites.
I found a couple more.
Oh, okay. So a few that will be getting a pleasant letter, to
Yes.
let them know what the ordinance says, and then if they don't respond, they'll get a less pleasant letter, and then if they don't respond to that, they'll be in this room for other purposes. So
We don't have an idea of how many of these are active,
the,
at least over the last 2 or 3 years.
that's on that other spreadsheet.
2018.
Yeah, I think many of these are, not all of them. These are obviously the most recent ones, but that, I don't know if you didn't bring the other spreadsheet.
No, I didn't.
A lot of it, I just know a lot of these.
But there's about 70 or so active.
So on this list, 42% of these houses applied for a tourist home permit within 2 years of having purchased it.
I found it very interesting that if you just look back in the last couple of years, just the frequency of these bars, the rows highlighted shows you that it's a much more recent phenomenon that people who are buying are applying within 2 years. That might have something to do with the pandemic, I mean, who knows where it's, but
So I looked at these numbers this afternoon and spent a little bit of time, and I'm bound to that to look at some assessments. And it looks like there was 17 approved here in the last 6 years, so it's an average of not quite 3 per year. And it looks like 2023 had 3 approved. And there was a number of these that seemed like the assessments on them were.
you mean that are active?
What?
Approved that were active, or?
2023, it shows
A 3.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
1.
7, 8. Well,
Oh.
that was 9, 7.
I was looking at the ones that were the highlighted.
And that just means they applied within 2 years of ownership.
Well, that's what I'm concerned about.
Oh, okay, yeah, Rivercombe, obviously, that was.
I'm looking at the ones that
Got it.
that are falling subject to this ordinance.
Yeah.
So I'm saying there were 17 on this list here that over the last 6 years, so it comes out to about 3 per year, and that's what actually looks like happened in 2023. And I went and looked at a lot of the assessments here. Some of them I couldn't trace, and some of them have been sold again. But it seemed like the assessments, there was a cluster of properties that were in the $400,000 to $500,000 range, and then there was other properties that were between $700,000 and $800,000. And thinking about some of these were properties that people had purchased, and they were not planning on, like you said, being there 100% of the time, and they were going to rent it out for a couple weekends a month. So, you know, we're addressing a problem that basically addresses approximately an issue of 3 houses per year in the county that are subject to this 2-year item. And if you look back over the last 6 years, it's been a very different time in our history. We had COVID, that everybody wanted to get out of cities, and they wanted to get out to the country and have a property. And I know, like, for example, Castleton Farms, all their properties down there, they were rented continuously for 2 or 3 years, and some of those had really high rents, $4,000 or $5,000 a month, and they rented and stayed rented. So it was a very unusual time, and people elected to buy properties. And then, you know, when COVID was over, they said, what are we going to do with it? We're going to sell it, we're going to do something, and I think this was an avenue. Plus, we had interest rates that were incredibly low. You know, you take a $500,000 house at 2%, it costs you $10,000 of interest to own that house per year. So it made people able to consider ventures that they normally probably wouldn't have considered. Now today, you got 7%, so that same, you know, $500,000 house is going to cost you $35,000 if you're going to finance it. So the economics of all this has changed. So how that's going to impact it going forward, I would think it's going to be, in one way, less consideration of people doing it. But then again, it may be, well, you know, if I'm going to buy this house, I need some income, I can swing this. So they may consider doing this. So it could work the other way too. But it makes it a lot more complicated for somebody to make that jump when you're looking to cover a $35,000 figure versus a $10,000 figure. And that doubles if you're looking at $1 million property. Now, we've been talking about these properties that had been licensed in the past that didn't have a sunset clause in them when they closed. So it sounds like maybe there's going to be 100 properties floating around here that when they sell, they're going to sell with a permit to have an Airbnb or whatever. So, yeah, there'll be 100 of them. So then, in essence, are going to be exempt from this ordinance.
Because it would go with the property, right?
It would go with the property. Mr. Gary, you got one, and yours is,
Yeah, well, it's a B&B, it's not a tourist home, but it,
You can sell it.
yeah, it's exempt. So you're going to have these floaters around that are going to be exempt, and that's going to create value for those people that other people won't have. So it's all about fairness, equalization, and how big of a problem that do we have. So
I think by allowing folks to waive this requirement, by having it their full, if they live there half the year, like Ms. Smith's comment was, maybe it was 185, that would equalize a lot in my mind. And then it's possible also, if you have an ADU on a piece of property, that could be waived. So for instance, if you buy a piece of property that has 2 houses on it or an ADU, you could say, okay, well, you're living there, but you're not living in the other house, but you can, you could apply then. That would seem reasonable. Those would be higher ticket properties likely. I just think that I keep reading all these things, about just communities and tourist homes, and it's a big deal here, and I think it's a really good source of revenue, and it helps our local economy. It's a hard question, because we have voluntarily kept our density very low. That's Rappahannock. That's part of what we have, right? 3,200 dwelling units, is that what we have? 7,300 according to the census, whatever. And our ratio is still the same as if you look, which is really interesting, if you look at Page and Madison, we have the same ratio of people at dwelling units, but we keep the density very low, and that's our decision. And so then you got a bunch of people that, want to stay in Rappahannock, and they're like, how do I do this? It's very difficult for me to do this, and I think it's kind of heartbreaking for them sometimes to see. It's just tough, I just think it's tough. So,
But does three basically addressing the disposal of 3 units per year really address the problem you're identifying?
I think it gives them an edge. It's like the house, and in Vegas, they get a 1% edge, and over time, truly, that's what it is. It's about 1%. And truly, over time, if you add that up over 10 years, you might pick up 7 families. That, for us, is significant when you've got a declining school population.
No, go ahead. I would like to comment on it. I personally think it's an elegant solution. I think that whether it's 3 or 5, improvement is improvement. Putting a bit of an edge and a damper on the speculative aspect, to your point about we don't know what the investor community would be, I think has significant merit. And don't forget also, if someone is doing some kind of investment property swap and they're looking like a 1031 deal where they have to they sold one investment property, they have to buy another one. If they can't do an Airbnb right away, they would also have a little bit more incentive to add something to the long-term stock for that period of 2 years. So I think it's a small impact, but if you consider the sort of check on speculation and the small increment to possibly improving long-term rental stock, we're here talking about it. We don't have much. We wouldn't. There's nothing ventured, nothing gained is the way I kind of see it. So I think it's really setting aside whether we have the legal authority to do it, which I think is. I don't really understand that fully, but I think that's a significant question. But obviously, if we have the authority, I think it's pretty good. And I know I was one of the ones who raised some of these other concerns about what if the property's already is a tourist home, and I think the idea of having the ability to waive it for full time, or to waive it if it's been permitted. I think those are pretty simple fixes to those concerns. So I think it feels very workable to me.
By having a 10-acre lots in ag and conservation area, really keeps a lot of the affordable residential properties out of the Airbnb category. Once you add that 10 acres, and we're having 10 acres now sell in the county. 5-acre lots have gone for $250. So, when you've got 10 acres out here, you're looking probably now $200 to $250 and put a house on it. It's going to be, more than $500,000. Probably going to be a $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 property. So that you're going to begin with. So that less than 10 acre category is still kind of a good place for the people that we're talking about to find a house. Now, of course, they can drift into Chester Gap, they can drift into Sperryville. We've seen people come into Rappahannock Lakes for Airbnb homes, so there are places where these Airbnbs can go that's, less than 10 acres. So,
Yeah, that's only the resident, I mean, that's only the agricultural limit, right? That's what
10
you're
acres,
referring to.
yeah, right, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of
was
these.
2 and 5, if I'm not
Mhm.
mistaken. So I agree that was, when that was reversed, or that changed, I guess it was changed to 2 and 5, and it was deemed void ab initio under that provision of the ordinance, and then it went to 10 and 20 is a big deal, I think. And at that time, it felt like a lot had been accomplished vis-a-vis what Mr. Carney's talking about, which is giving people a chance, for sure. I think that was a huge step in the right direction. And not to call you out, but, I mean, I don't know, how is your property zoned ag or?
No, I live in Woodville.
Okay, all right, yeah, so, but, I mean, people we all know, sometime after that ordinance change, actually acquired properties that were ag properties of a few acres, and I could see a scenario where had that not changed, to your point, those properties easily, given the investment or the interest rate and resulting investment environment, easily could have been swept up and never been left for people you and I know to buy those properties. So I think that was a big deal, and it's an important point.
But I want to make sure I didn't miss something. There still is the issue of the smaller properties that are in residential zone areas.
True, yeah.
And so, that to me is a significant segment that would be a potential beneficiary of this kind of cooling period and maybe a little bit more likely to take some expensive time in a long-term rental state.
I think the point here on the change to the 10 acres and all the other changes in 170, 66K, the type 2 road and different things, those just came in, a handful of years ago. And relative to this thought that these people who have received authorization to have a tourist home, somehow it's vested and baked into the property forever, and there should be the expectation that the next owner should be able to have it. That just doesn't exist. And there's several situations where someone might have a permit today, but when that property sells, it will not qualify because they do not live on a public road or a private road that's type 2 or meet 10 acres or meet all of the other requirements in 170, 66K.
In cases when they have.
And they would be existing in non-conforming if there was no expiration of their permit, and they would be able to be grandfathered, so to say, and keep it forever. But for those that have a sunset, those properties are done, unless the ordinance was changed again to back out some of those restrictions, which were put in place because of the pain points that you were seeing in your public hearings about private roads and different things like that.
Well, which ordinance was passed first, or most recent? Or
Well,
which change?
there were several changes to 170, 66K at the same time, and I think just before that, the whole fix for the 2 to 5 going to 10, which didn't work, but so that it reverted back, and then it was changed back to 10 for the proper public hearing.
But I think part of your question is, when did we start putting
Or it didn't carry over.
ends at a transfer? That was no rule change or regulatory change. That's
No, that was
something
just
we
a
started
condition,
doing
yeah.
And adding as a condition, which, again, I've never felt terribly comfortable with that
Yeah.
on legal
A couple of
grounds.
years.
And that ordinance section that enabled it's been on the books for a long time.
Right, but in terms of, we started doing this because we decided to do it, there was no change to any underlying.
Yeah, my point is just, there's no guarantee that if you had it now, the next owner will be able to get it. And it might be precluded and barred from getting it based on the ordinance, or it just might not be appropriate anymore based on the lessons learned over that period of time, that it doesn't rise to the point of revocation, but the feedback that you've received from the community for that particular location suggests that there aren't conditions you can put in place to really make it appropriate for that spot. And I'm sure there are many that it's a no-brainer because There's been not a single complaint over the last 10 years. Property changes hands. It's as good today as it was yesterday, meets all the requirements, and, sure.
Well, as a resident of Chester Gap, I feel like I'm the only one that doesn't like them in my neighborhood. No one else seems to complain about them. So I've kind of honored their wishes. But right across the street from me, there's one that conveyed to the next property owner and has now recently sold again. And so I like the tool of saying it terminates. I don't know those people. I knew the first ones. I knew when they built the house. I had friends that were in a pinch, had to come to town from Seattle to attend a funeral, and they put them up. So, but they were my neighbors. I knew who they were. I don't know who these people are. They don't live there. Don't
Brian,
live there.
somebody told me on Tuesday that the house was just built for those purpose.
A girl came
Yeah, that's-
in not too long ago.
Copy.
So I asked,
Is that the one that's?
I asked the people that live
started?
up the mountain from her. They have had no complaints about it. We had dinner over there one night, and I said, "Oh, they lived in that house next door to the one that had some issues. We got some complaints with all the bears, the trash, a few years ago." And when I went to the house, I said, "Oh my gosh, this is that house. It's amazing." He goes, "Oh no, that's next door." But their house was apparently just as bad on the inside as the other one was on the outside. But I asked them about the Airbnb, and they said they had no complaints about it. So.
Well, in addition to the termination upon sale, I think Mr. Henry had brought up something several meetings ago about the renewal, the yearly fee or whatever. I think that would go a long way. To
So
the people want to do
the
this.
board did adopt the ordinance to authorize the registry, and the Commissioner of Revenue can require application annually. The ordinance is adopted, doesn't include a fee, and I explained to the board, maybe not to the planning commission, that the treasurer and Commissioner of Revenue didn't want to put any impediment or dissuade people from applying, because they felt the prize was knowing who was who, so that we could collect the transient occupancy tax, rather than putting a barrier in place and cause people to say, well, maybe I can just not register and sneak out of the tax.
What do you think of that?
I think it's a terrible, I mean, every county puts a fee, it's no different than a decal on a car. It's
Business license?
Yeah, business license,
And that could go in conjunction with what Mr. Mack was saying about doing the inspection or make sure they have the,
I think that's a little tricky. We don't adopt the property maintenance code here. You can live in very substandard conditions in your home. And so having different requirements for one that has transient occupancy, I don't know if that, I feel uneasy about applying two different standards. I do understand, though, in some situations, people know where they are and understand how to communicate, and others are people that have just come to the area and they don't fit know what streets they're on. If they happen to get 911 on their cell phone, they wouldn't be able to explain where they are. So I think there's a balance of some sort, but.
You were talking about $100 fee or
Well,
something.
what Shenandoah County
Yeah.
did, Shenandoah County did a survey of all their Airbnbs, and the average rental was $230 a night. So their permit fee was $230
Are you?
a year. Basically, one night's fee is how they present it. And nobody had a problem with that. My son has an Airbnb, and there's no problem.
Yeah, and so the ordinance is in place, and you could very simply add a fee to it.
I think as much as we need the income in this county for all different purposes, that, that would generate, I don't know what, if it was $200, it would generate $35,000, almost as much income as, and I think this is generating.
No, so you've only got
Yeah.
70
Oh,
active.
70?
You have 70 active.
But the direct lodging tax, to your point, that we're realizing from all of these is, it used to be like 10 grand a year. I'm sure it's triple that now.
I was wondering if we could review those numbers.
Yeah, it's gotten more significant.
That's
but
still, comparatively not a big number.
Yeah, this isn't absolutely precise, it's pretty close, as the documents are put in. But you can see in FY '22, about $55,000 for tourist home. And then there's bed and breakfast and your more in-type things. And then you see there's a bucket left over from Airbnb or VRBO that wasn't able to be binned into the right category. Year to date this year, 44.9. The last 12 months, 59. So, you know.
So if you had a fee of $250, every 100 people would generate $25,000 every 100 permits, you know.
And it's part of the annual registry and all that good stuff. It makes sense.
Yeah, like, so, it's an $800 application fee.
Yes, for a special exception, 900.
If you're,
And that's because
This
you're
is just
talking
my
about
thinking.
4 ads in
Okay.
the newspaper.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say, if you're worried about scaring people away, it's right there.
Yeah.
It's not about once they've gotten it. And once people are getting it, you just tell them, oh, and by the way, this comes with a $1,200 a year. Okay, cool, I'll pay for it. They'll do it. It's just, I think if they're gonna be scared of it, they're not gonna apply $100 to go through the process. That would be my thing.
And if we're gonna watch this program and spend time watching it and see how it grows and see how it performs and all this, we should cover the cost on it, you know, between staff and any revisions that we have to do in the ordinance. So I think, you know, fee and that thing would be very appropriate.
And also just having a mechanism that locks in real numbers.
Real numbers.
Because I talked to you about one time and you had just been to check the number of active ones and it was a fraction of what we all imagined given the robust application activity we had seen during that same time. It felt like there were hundreds of these.
Yeah.
And then you went and found out that there were not hundreds of active ones. So I think with some kind of annual registration fee, the new ordinance language requiring the registry.
Yeah, but the new state law is just rolling into effect, so all these intermediaries have to provide the information now.
Yeah.
So we're just beginning to feel the impact of that.
But we'll soon have real numbers that we can count on. And then we can all, as a community, have a discussion about whether the absolute number of these is in fact reaching a point where it's undermining the fundamental character of our community and any other adverse effects.
Someday in the very distant future, we can plot these in a GIS system and see if they're concentrated in any particular area.
And you can use this money that you collect on the permits to help fund that GIS system.
When Chris Parrish is out of town.
Does it seem that burdensome to not have a tourist home for 2 years? If you're speaking of cost and benefit, if you bought a piece of property you can't afford, you could rent that property for 2 years until you can get the permit. I think it's a really good idea. And to make available some of these houses to local people and not to have investors come in and pick them up just for the sake of investment without any desire to live here whatsoever.
There's something you mentioned that I'm wondering if it makes sense to try to actually have more of it allowed is the person that buys a house that's got a barn apartment or a garage apartment or whatever, is there a way that it's almost, I don't want to say incentivized, but it's positive for a local person to be able to rent an apartment on a property that somebody is going to buy anyway, if they have that room available. And I don't know if there's a way for us to.
You can rent it long-term today. Many of those situations are non-conforming, multiple buildings on a parcel well before zoning was ever in place, tenant houses and things like that. They're just there and they're grandfathered in. The newer ones would have gone through one of the permit processes where there's a family apartment back in the day, or it was a guest house and missing some critical piece of the puzzle. Guest houses are allowed by right as an accessory use, have been for a long time, and I know Mr. McCarthy would kind of weigh a test on it whether it was a full home or not. Right? Do you have like bathrooms and kitchens? Or do you actually have a full kitchen, or maybe you're missing a stove, and so then it's okay? or now an ADU, but there are some restrictions on where they can go, where they can't go. But you could certainly, if somebody had a permit for an ADU, you might say, that's a by right use to have a tourist home. I don't know. I mean, you could do a lot of different things with a owner-occupied situation, and the BZA did get into that maybe 2019 when they were beginning to look at potential changes to ordinances, and I think Planning Commission was looking at things too. How can you bin these uses into different appropriatenesses levels, and it's all possible.
I think going down the road in the next decade and trying to address some type of more affordable housing in the county without rezoning areas and providing small lots. A way to address this is to make accessory dwellings on properties easier for landlords, for owners to do. I mean, particularly larger parcels. If you got somebody that has 200 or 300 acres, I mean, that's a wonderful atmosphere for a family to be. Kumley's place, he had those 2 or 3 houses that he built on the farm. I mean, he looked after me who was in there, and those people had an opportunity to live in modern housing, and did that impact the area having those? Really didn't. So that would probably be a long-term way to help address affordable housing and provide more units in the county.
And it's a way that-
I'm sorry.
It seems to be, from what I've heard from everybody at some point or another, if they're on that property that somebody's living on all the time, it's a much better situation than they just come and check on it every 6 months when they get back in town.
When we did the cell towers the first time, way back when, it was the idea floating around that the cell towers would go onto large parcels, and to give those properties some added income that would help hold them together maybe longer.
Sure.
And, they were large parcels, and I don't think any of those parcels have been divided or really sold other than one, because the lady died. So that was a successful policy that was thought of. So same thing with
Similar.
Yeah.
What are you going to say?
I think the simplest one, the solution would be to protect the 2 subdivisions that we currently have and not allow them there. The Rappahannock Lakes people have come in every time, spitting mad. And me, I was the only one who just... But I guess it hasn't bothered anybody yet in Chester Gap, but I imagine it could.
And if we have affordable
That's where
housing in the county,
affordable housing is.
that's where it is. Smaller houses and smaller land, that's how you get to affordable price.
Just talking about houses on large parcels, one thought I had a couple of years ago, and I talked to Mr. Curry in passing, this is really tangential to our tourist home discussion, was the idea that there are some houses that are barely habitable or not at all, and what could we as a county do to incentivize the renovation of those properties for use as normal, not short-term, but normal rentals. We talked about tax abatement, and it seems like the only allowable incentive might be something in the way of suppressing the assessed value to incentivize somebody to renovate them and then put them into the rental market. But I would think that, just now back to the tourist home question, to the extent that we would try to address affordable housing problem over a long period of time, to the extent that those large parcels had houses on them already renovated or were renovated, I think we would also want to be careful not to have those then fall into the tourist home market, because that would then undermine what we're trying to accomplish in the long term. So I mean, it's kind of a different question, but I don't know if communities like ours with lots of these big farms with dilapidated houses or rundown houses or uninhabitable houses have found a creative way to incentivize those property owners to put money into those dwellings.
Well, I mean, the commercial aspect is the best motivator, that they think they get money out of it one way or another, whether it's long-term or short-term rental. And if they don't think they can get a return, it's likely not to invest. So how do you do that?
I'm just saying from a jump start
Yeah.
perspective.
Yeah.
The benevolent fund has been talking about this, and one of the ideas was the benevolent fund would go in and repair the house if there was a contract with the owner that house would be rented below market value after it had been improved. And I'm not sure how far they got with that.
I think that was something the Habitat for Humanity was looking at as well, wasn't it?
Exactly, yeah, exactly.
I had talked to somebody from Habitat for Humanity about a program like that, and they said it's simply something that they don't do. They don't function in that way.
But, yeah, because one of the problems for Habitat for Humanity is once it gets fixed up, you can rent it under market values for a certain amount of time, and then you can escalate the rent. I mean, they can't hold them to that rent forever.
So there's been a lot of talk about 176K has several requirements. And I think this discussion was really, do you want to add one more? You had some public comment that suggested, well, maybe you should look at the whole thing. That may be true, but this conversation was really focused on, do you add one more? There's a process to do that. You could also look at reviewing the full lot of them now or at some time in the future, but I think that's a critical point for the bodies to figure out. If you're going to move something forward, is it an incremental step of adding something to the ordinance, or do you want to open this thing wide open and look at all of the requirements in that section?
Well, I think Mr. Wright raised a good point. Have any of these kinds of programs or changes been tested, or is there an opinion by the state's attorney general as to how we can do these, or whether we can do these?
Well, Mr. Goff reviewed the state code, and he felt very comfortable that you can do this. I don't know that we have a true reading case law that showed that this very precise thing has been tested in court, but he felt comfortable with it.
I think to pass other restrictions that are probably more onerous than this, and I think they've been upheld.
I was gonna make another connection that I think argues in favor of the adding a 2-year, we're talking about the ADUs a bit. The original, that used to be tourist, guest house and family apartment, then we just sort of backed off on that whole concept in mind, made them ADUs. But I don't think we've really seen the sort of clever investor who comes in with a package that has sort of 2 tourist homes built in, one a main house and one some accessory dwelling unit. And again, I think before we get ourselves in a situation like that, because of an aggressive investor, having a 2-year delay to kind of cool that would make that a little less likely. I think that's untested. I don't mean to be paranoid about it, but I don't think we've seen necessarily all the possible uses of the changes we've already made.
Well, you have seen down 231, property with 5 tourist homes on one parcel, right? And then there was all property that, I don't know, 6 or 8 of them, or. It's not a precise ADU, but you have multiple dwellings on one parcel that are all tourist homes released in the one down 231. And you have one is a principal residence and the other 4 are not.
So let's just talk about those 2 right there. Now, is that a bad thing, or is that a good thing?
Yeah, I don't know. They're unlikely to, are they unlikely to be on the market for long-term rental by those families? And the answer is, who knows? I mean, they used to be maybe to support the farm or something like that, but times have changed.
I mean,
and-
for example, the property on 231, that was on the market to be sold. And this young person is, he's trying to make a go of it. So he's got 5 units that he's trying to rent to get an income to keep the land together. And I think that's what we're trying to do, is keep these big parcels together. So we're not giving him anything, it's not government support, he's making it every day. And Roselle down there, they made millions of dollars of investments of all kind of things in that property.
So this provision wouldn't preclude either of those.
Yeah.
things.
I know,
Yeah.
but we're talking
Yeah, but they would
about,
work
is
in
it bad? I mean, we just kind of said it was a little, we shaded Bruce Brown, talking about it, we kind of shaded it a little bit. So, is this
Well-
good or bad?
Well,
That's
to
a good
me,
question.
to me, neither of those is the scenario that I was talking about. Where I have a bit of a bright line is if we start seeing people coming in and building things that don't seem like long-term houses. So you come in and you build something that has a house and an ADU that you intend to build both of them maybe in a smaller lot and close together, but because you can do it as a main dwelling and an ADU, now you've got 2 tourist home potential properties, structures on one lot where you might have had 1. That to me is a very different scenario, and to me, we started to see more of these cases where people are actually thinking about coming in and building something specifically to serve a short-term market, and that, I think, concerns me a little bit, because we've always looked at this as sort of, yes, it's commercial, but it's really a kind of a residential use, and that implies that these houses could otherwise be lived in.
And this came up when that section, I remember Dale talking about Battle Run, and you don't want somebody to go build something weird down there where your neighbor is, and in residential and resource preservation, which is all the residential and ag and conservation, if you build one of these things, can't be more than 2 stories, and it has to look like a single-family home. I don't know, that's a little subjective, but that was the kind of the fix at that time to say, well, speculators aren't going to come in and build a new structure for the purpose of a tourist home. At least it has to look like a house. So hopefully it would function like a house, and if it stopped being useful as a tourist home, somebody else could make it go.
So Gary, let's just look, I'm just looking at the other side. So just scenario of somebody coming in, buying a property and doing an ADU. So they would have to buy 10 or 20 acres in the ag area, unless they were in a town and work through all that. They have to have 10 or 20 acres, ag conservation area. So they come in and they own it.
Wait a minute, why would they have to do that? What could they do that?
If they're contemplating a tourist home.
A tourist home.
But if they were in R5, they wouldn't have
He
to have 10
he
acres.
added that as a caveat.
Yeah,
He's just saying, for example.
yeah,
Okay.
it's a lot more.
Well, but if you're going to oppose my scenario,
Okay, we'll do all
My
3.
scenario.
We'll do all 3. We'll do all the inputs, but primarily most of these have ended up in ag and conservation. Okay, so you got to have 10 or 20 acres, and they come in and they own it for 2 years. They live there or rent it on an annual basis, and then they do their ADU for the tourist home. Is that a bad thing? So we're talking about having more ADUs, and these permits expire when they sell the property. So when they sell that property, there's an ADU there that somebody's built. So that's a housing unit that is now available for someone, whether it's an affordable unit or they wait 2 more years before the new owner, before they do it again. But there's a unit there that's now in the rental pool that's available. So you've created an asset there for the county. And there's, if they do a tourist home, there's no kid there to educate. I mean, there's no cost of school there in that ADE building, and so you've got revenue actually coming in. So, is it bad? I'm not talking about developing the county, but there's 2 sides to everything we talk about.
Well, I think that is a point that Mr. Parrish used to make all the time, is that sometimes these uses can be a source of income for people that might not otherwise be able to stay in the county or figure out a way forward in the county. And I look at this list and I see a lot of people that having a tourist home, for some of them, enabled them to keep their family home in the county, and maybe they won't live there, but they can come and visit as much as they like. Or they live on or adjacent to the parcel where their tourist home is, and it allows them to keep their family land together. So, I mean, there's a lot of that on here too.
The most exciting one I've seen on here was Mr. Jenkins here, you know, 231. You know, he works hard, he has an orchard, I mean, he makes every penny he has from the earth, and he bought the property next door, and applied for an Airbnb there, in the house that he fixed up on the property, and there's another one. And we were able to put 2 properties together there, what he originally had into this one. And I thought that was a real gain for us, as a county, and we didn't spend any tax dollars or any government dollars there. So, I mean, that was a real win on that one.
Yeah, so I think people living next door on the parcel it really frames people's perception of the rental differently too, because you still have a neighbor. It's not just a stranger coming in. You know that your neighbor's there overseeing the operation, and it enables them to maybe be able to figure out a way forward that they normally wouldn't have.
Absolutely, and that's when I first sort of thought about it. It occurred to me that if we did a 2-year thing, it would allow families that have these houses that they're trying to keep in their family, they could still do this with this. No problem. And they could combine the lots if they would needed to do that. They can absolutely do that. I have a hard time seeing a downside to doing this, other than just basic, it just might cool off selling houses a little bit. That's the only downside that I can see. There might be a few individuals that this could apply to that it would not be great for them, but there are a lot more than a few individuals where tourist homes are not great for them. And I never hear somebody coming up to me saying, you guys need to loosen restrictions on tourist homes. Never. So this is what I'm hearing from the community. I'm having I just can't see a downside, honestly. I mean, I'm a business owner. I am pro-business, and I think we need to, as a board, I think we need to do more things to support our businesses in the county. I truly do. But on this thing, I feel like there's a tide going out on us here.
Agreed.
And it's not going away. That's just my feeling. I think it's just going to get tougher and tougher.
I think you call it tide going out, and I called it 5 years ago. I think I talked to the BZA and I called it a slippery slope. And it really came down to the subjective question, or the subjective scenario, which we're seeing play out even more than we did 5 years ago in communities across our country, and frankly, communities around the world that are seeing sense of community undermined by a proliferation of Airbnb type rentals. Here, that's not as applicable, except maybe up in a place like Chester Gap, and Brian made the perfect point. Like, you don't know the people across the street. The rest of the county, where it's not a collection of neighborhoods, so to speak, with the exception of maybe the town of Washington, where there are a few. In other places, the impact in that regard is less. But it's still to me, an important question to keep in mind is, like, to what extent, by not exercising some control, are we inviting a slow erosion of our sense of community? And I know that's somewhat fluffy, subjective stuff, but it's happening in a lot of communities where people increasingly saying, my gosh, I don't know anybody who lives around me anymore. Or the streets are empty when overnight renters aren't there for the people who are there everyday living. Again, we don't have the density where I think we're going to feel that necessarily anywhere but in Chester Gap as one example, but it's still, for me, an important backdrop to keep in mind, because our population in the end is quite small to begin with.
It is a burden, I guess. Only desirable, beautiful places bear, I guess, you know?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a shame to live in such a wonderful place.
Right.
I think you've got to include Rappahannock Lakes in this.
Yeah.
Because we have had several complaints from residents in that, when they come forward about these tourist homes. And I know we just recently, since I've been on this planning commission board, we had one that was a truly investment. The 2 of them come in and bought a home right in Rappahannock Lakes, and immediately come in for an application for a tourist home. And we had a lot of the residents in there complained about, you know, strange people coming in, walking over their property and everything,
Yeah.
that they're raising families in there, so I'm sure that's the same way with, you know, Chester Gap.
Yeah,
Rappahannock Lakes is one of them as well.
yeah, you're right, exactly right.
And I do agree, I think this, I support this is the right step, if we can do the 2-year, if it can be done legal. I do support that, and I firmly believe that when you come into our county as an investor, I feel like you need to be vested in our county for a period of time before you start reaping the benefits of what you come here just to invest in. I firmly believe in that. Now, I don't think this will maybe put a scratch on the need that we have for housing. But we've got to chase another rabbit to help our people. And I firmly believe, I support business coming to our county, but also I firmly believe that we have got to take care of our own people. Our own people that have been born and raised in this county. We've got to do some things to help them to be able to have a house, if it's nothing more than a rental. So I feel like we, as the boards, we've got to step up and do something to help this situation. There is a drastic need for housing in this county, because we've got school teachers, who again, I know y'all have heard this, a broken record, you hear me quite often speak about it. But we have school teachers, we have deputies, and we have workers of staff of the county that can't afford to live in the county. And one thing is, we don't even have a house pump now. So, but I think that's probably gonna be for another serious meeting that we can come together and hash out something. Well, just one thing that comes to my mind, the village of Spurville. The history of Spurville is, at one time, all of the houses in Spurville was lived in by residents. Then you had the influx of people coming in, buying up all the houses, turning them into little shops. So now, you don't have no housing for people that wants to live in Spurville. It's all been taken up with these little shops, they're business, you know, they have a right to be in our community as well. But what about those people, again, that wants to stay in Rappahannock County, and wants to live in the village of Spurville? There's not a house there. But just one thing comes to mind, and I don't know if this is for another meeting, but we have landowners that have 1 acre lots. Could those 1 acre lots be cut in half, or a half acre lot, and have 2 homes built on, with providing homes for people, not being a big investor coming in and buying up all those lots and but some type of profit that if these houses, if you can have a half acre lot to build a house on in Sparrow because they have sewer, then those houses can be turned into rentals or possibility of a person to be able to buy them, not at an outrageous price.
The very interesting about Sperryville is that Main Street is village commercial, and residential is not a by right use. So the forefathers, if you will, decided we don't want people to live on Main Street. Now, of course, the board controls that sort of thing. If you thought that residential was an appropriate use, and if somebody's living there today because it's been vested, and they stop living in the house for 2 years and it becomes a little shop, you can't live there again unless you come and get a special exception.
Because I recall when I was going to school, and probably when Miss Bruce back, I probably remember the same thing. Our school teachers lived in Spurville. My first grade school teacher, my second grade school teacher, all lived in the little village of Spurville. We all walked to the local school there together. But there's not housing for them.
A lot of our George Washingtons and Thomas Jeffersons are founding fathers here in Rappahannock County with the zoning ordinance. did very unique things, and sometimes they were self-serving.
Maybe.
I'm shocked.
Yeah, so they were not exactly,
Yeah. So, trying to keep conversation, it's been fantastic conversation. If there's an interest to move forward with an amendment to put out to the public to see what they think is appropriate, yes, you have to have a public hearing, the planning commission and board, of course, they could be joined if you wanted to. Staff would need to know if the language that is listed, and I think based on everything I've heard, bed and breakfast is not what you're looking to do here. If you have a bed and breakfast, maybe not a 2-year waiting period for that. But for tourist home, so that green section might just say tourist home. But what about these other things that I've heard about? Primary residence and whether there was a past approved permit or whether it's an ADU. Do you want to have carve-outs somehow included in whatever language you would put out to the community to gain their input?
I think, my opinion is keep it simple and keep the 2-year thing in there as it's written. And because you get into these ADUs and all this other thing, I think it takes there'll be a lot of revisions there and a lot of...
It's confusing.
Yeah, a lot to do. So if you want to get it in place now and get it done, I think 2 years.
Keep it simple.
Yeah.
Understandable and easily enforceable.
But only for tourist homes, not for bed and breakfast.
Correct.
Right. Which I think seems eminently reasonable. You're gonna live there, you can do it.
But right now, there is no carve-out for those, right? So there's no carve-out language for if you're living there full-time.
No, there's not.
We'd have to add that.
That was my question, and so what question do you want to put to the public?
Yeah, so
Isn't that a bed and breakfast though, would you have to be there?
Well, bed and breakfast, you're allowed to have 5 rooms but you have to live on property, and so you rent the 5 rooms out independently, whereas the tourist homes, you have to rent the entire structure out all in one thing. And you don't have to be on-site manager.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, there's a distinction there, yeah, okay.
So if you're worried about units coming out of the market, would there be any chance if somebody's looking to buy something, say, well, we can't do a tourist home, but we'll do a bread and breakfast?
Probably.
Huh?
Probably.
Won't
It's
happen.
such a bigger deal.
Okay.
And this only applies to those situations where a tourist home is in fact a special exception. There are some of our zoning districts are by right, in the village areas and whatnot. You just get to do it.
I think keeping it easy, 2 years is clean.
I think it's a brighter line for the community to understand what it means to be able to then provide you feedback through the public hearing, so that you can decide if we missed the boat or there's broad support.
What's the administrative mechanism we're faced with in this joint meeting is still driven entirely by the planning commission and here in terms of...
You're both, you can do whatever you want, quite frankly. But short of adopting an ordinance that hasn't been put out public hearing.
Shouldn't we, could the planning commission now make a recommendation to the board of supervisors and vote on it and then send it to the board?
Yes, absolutely. Sure. And the board could then take a vote to authorize staff to advertise a public hearing for this language at whatever future meeting.
Does this obviate the need for the planning commission to have a public hearing?
No. No. You could do a joint public hearing at some point in time in the future, but any ordinance must have a public hearing before.
I think it would be worthwhile to have 2.
Separate, yes.
To let people,
So-
if we have people come out in droves saying, do not do this, it would be worthwhile.
But normally the way we set these ordinances up is, the preamble will lay out kind of how we got here. And so I would do that in this case, and I would even say there's a joint meeting at which time the planning commission recommended to the board to advertise this for public hearing at future, meetings, and the board accepted the recommendation and directed staff to do it,
Okay,
if that's what happens.
but they still must hold their own public hearing.
Short of a joint public hearing, yeah.
So the other potential carve-out that was discussed earlier that isn't here is the option to waive this requirement if it was previously operated as a tourist home, so we're foregoing that.
Yeah, so I talked to Warren County a little bit about some of this, and they're struggling right now with some waiver language they have some setback requirements. So if the home is, I don't know, 100 feet away from the neighbor, then it's needed, it's required, except the board could waive it. And they're really struggling for equal application and what is the subjective metric that they're supposed to use, and they were moving away from that waiver and having a brighter line. So I know they've struggled with it. The board and planning commission would then have to struggle with what is appropriate for waiver. You have one item in here now, and that's the 10 to 20 acres, which is, that can be waived. It's never been done, and when would it be appropriate? And once you do it once, does that all of a sudden open up this opportunity broader?
Okay, so whether it's a waiver or a bright line, I think the point is, there was some discussion about how that's going, if something has been operating as a tourist home on a permit that expires with transfer, it gets transferred, now that tourist home is out of service for 2 years. Is that the intent? I thought there was some discussion
I
around
think we did discuss whether or not.
Yeah, well, and it could be out of service forever because it doesn't meet the acreage requirement or the road requirement or
Sure.
various other things.
Not germane to the matter here, though, which is,
The only
How does the
exception,
2 years apply?
how does the 2 years apply if it is otherwise suitable, and it's been operating, so you've got a tourist home, it's been there 5-10 years, sells, now it's gotta go off the market for 2 years because the permit didn't work, even if it otherwise is appropriate.
not all of them are gonna go off the market, are they, Gary? The ones that.
No, many, most of the old ones won't because they don't have that sunset clause.
They don't have a sunset clause.
Right, but please,
Everybody
I
else
understand not everyone fits the scenario I'm describing, but I am describing a scenario that exists.
We want to be
Want to-
clear on what the.
Do we want them to have to go off? They would otherwise meet the requirements, they've been operating under permit. The only thing that's different about them is they have a permit where we said it ends on transfer of the property. Now it transfers, and we're, without any other change to this, saying it's gotta go away for 2 years.
So absolutely, I think wording could change to somehow wrap that in. And this is a bar against application, right? So if you already have it and you're vested and there's no sunset clause, it just stays. You don't have to apply, right? So this addition is only for those people who have to apply. So you could definitely put something in this sentence or a second sentence that says that in the scenario you're talking about,
But
they can submit an
But
application.
isn't it
It
very?
doesn't guarantee anything, you just get to submit an
Isn't
application.
it very clear that on the existing permits that they have, that it ends?
Yeah, oh,
when they
yeah.
sell?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, now whether they're barred from applying or not for 2 years is the question at hand.
That's the question.
So I don't think you have to address it because of Al's point that if the permit expires, it expires. And not to put words in your mouth, but I think that's what we're talking about is if you don't have a permit, then you in fact are required to live there 2 years before applying for a permit that you do not
That's
have.
the threshold question.
If that's what you intend, I thought there was
discussion.
There was
some
definitely
discussion.
discussion about it. However, I do think this is a good idea because this is not stopping tourist homes. We're going to continue having applications. People are going to buy them, they're going to sit on them for 3 years, and then they're going to try. They're going to go for it.
Yeah, hopefully they're
It's
gonna
not
have a
gonna
long-term
stop.
rental and see how wonderful that is.
Right?
But, you know, it's, to Gary's point, I mean, we did discuss it for sure. And it was something I thought about, and I was like, well, you know, but they do have to reapply. And to Gary's point, we don't know, we don't have any data on it, but let's say 34% of them can't even do it anyway. And then you have the other ones, and it's like, they're gonna have to come in with a brand new application after they've done X, Y, and Z to the property. Who knows? They may get denied for some other reason we haven't foreseen. But I think that it doesn't preclude people from continuing to try to get tourist homes. It just means you have to.
It's a pause.
Well, but it also
Yeah,
dampens the resale.
I mean, they could, and
Yeah.
Sorry.
I don't think it's that burdensome, right?
There should be, you know,
I think,
psychologically, there's probably an expectation, oh, these other people had a tourist home, I can get a tourist home. And people move here and think they're gonna get a tourist home without even knowing we have a zoning ordinance about it, right? And so now it's a different level of, well, somebody already had it, I must be able to get it. And they might be barred by a new ordinance, or they'd be barred for 2 years by this. There should be no expectation that you automatically get one of these things.
Yeah, I mean,
Unless you're in a village setting where it's by right.
But would it be by,
This doesn't apply
This is a-
unless it's a special exception, because it's in our.
okay, this is only special exception, so it does.
Yeah, and I mean, and those property, at least the recent permits where, I think I'm correct about this, where the special exception, special use permit for a short-term rental, did not convey with the property, often involved applications that maybe were more or less acceptable, but that brought with them some concerns. And so I think it is perhaps a good protective measure to not lump those non-convey with property type permits into an exception. Those should be covered by the 2-year requirement, I think.
Plus, to Mr. Henry's point, there are a number of houses, properties out there that have it baked in forever.
On the flip side.
Which
Right.
inherently will create, it'll be like a liquor license in New Jersey
Huh.
with a certain amount of them,
Right.
and they're worth money because of it forever.
Or a fishing
And
license.
the value is baked into those parcels,
Yes, yeah, yeah,
for people to know what they're looking for.
yes.
So those are valuable
Correct.
properties.
So I guess I was driving to, if there's a direction for staff to advertise this, it would, to Mr. Henry's point, it would make sense for the planning commission to make a recommendation to the board, and then the board ultimately to authorize or request the staff to take action to set up that public
I
hearing.
see.
Well, I'm prepared to move that the planning commission recommend to the supervisors that we go ahead with this, with the one revision that it says tourist home and scratch and bed and breakfast, or bed and breakfast. I think that was the main thing that changed.
Thank you, Mr. Light. Do we have a second?
So that motion, does it need to be, should that to be advertised or sent to the board? Because you mentioned
Yeah, I
advertising.
think I assume that's a recommendation to the board that they proceed with this, or,
Yeah, that's what I thought was
I-
our
the
prerogative.
board's already sent it to the planning commission to say, hey, we think you should do this. Now, thinking through everything.
You said it.
Yeah.
That's why I asked for it.
The board sent it to the planning commission saying, do this thing, and if you're not gonna change it other than the bed and breakfast, I think you're now, the planning commission is saying, okay, thanks for the idea, board, we're gonna do it. So I think the planning commission probably has to direct staff to set the public hearing. Sorry.
That's what I.
Diversion.
Should it just be a joint public hearing since we're meeting?
Well, the logistics get to be a pain, but you can.
I just think whatever comes out of the planning commission should be clear on what public hearing is being scheduled. Whether it's theirs, well, they're not direct, I mean, if they direct us to have a public hearing and we can't skip over.
Well, I don't think they're gonna direct you to have
Yeah,
public hearings.
it's going there.
But if there is the first meeting.
I think there's value in having a sequential public hearings.
So I think I did say I recommend we pass it back to the supervisor. I think what I meant was I recommend that we request.
Set this for
staff
public
to set
hearing.
up a public hearing for the planning commission.
At the planning commission, and then we'll follow up with the
You
board.
said it now.
All right,
I'll
I'll
second
let that
that.
straighten it. Thank Al. Thank you, Al. All right, any further
Good
discussion?
sausage.
Wait, do we have a second?
I did.
Yeah, we did.
Oh,
Snuck it in there.
he always keeps me guessing.
All right, if there's no further discussion, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you.
Not on the planning commission.
All kinds of-
I thought that was a great discussion.
Okay, so now we need a motion from the board.
I don't think you necessarily do at this point.
Okay.
I was wrong.
Good.
I'll say that, and I think because you already referred it to the planning commission, it was in their report, and if there was significantly changed language, I think it would make sense for them to recommend and say, hey, I think you got it wrong, board, we
Okay,
think you
that's
should
fine.
do this. But-
So once they complete their work, then it'll come to us. Okay,
Well done.
good.
So I don't know how involved you want to get into Berkeley Group project. Good public feedback today. This very large project was broken into multiple phases. Phase one that the planning commission recommended the board move forward with is basically what you're seeing here, which was the reorganization and attempt to clean up the administrative processes in the ordinance and not get into who is allowed to do what where and through what hoops they have to jump. That was thought to be a future phase. The conversation you just had about tourist homes, future phase, right? That's who can have a tourist home where and what they have to do. This is about how do they apply, through what processes, and making sure the language is defensible and put together in a way that hopefully is easy to follow. That still is a very large task and big change. I've provided some very preliminary comments to Berkeley Group, like it has to be codified, like our code is already codified with chapters and all that. Can't use what they've set up. And then little things like they use the term setback a lot of different places where we just don't do that. We talk about minimum yards, and so
We use setback in the definition of yard,
yeah,
which is where I understand what setback means. I don't like it.
yeah, minimum yard is really the core of how we do this. You can only do certain things in minimum front and rear yards and side yards. And then there's also the front yard. That's different than the minimum front yard.
Culpeper has a yard definition and a setback.
Yeah. So, maybe that confusion is the sort of thing that would be in phase two when we say, hey, this is complicated on how we're doing things, as opposed to in the front of the book, we wanted to say this, and then, rather than the definitions being in the front, we want them in the back and things like that. There are some more substantive things in here, and one of the main ones is on the enforcement side, and I cataloged some of these for the board when I brought feedback or introduced it to them. That's civil penalties. So the first, if you have an enforcement issue, the first stop is a civil penalty. It's a defined fee that's set out in the state code. And the state says you can do civil penalties and criminal. Right now, all we can do is criminal penalties. So you're charging somebody with a misdemeanor for what they did, no matter how egregious the zoning violation is. And there's, the burden in court is just different, as opposed to a civil penalty where somebody can say, all right, I'll just pay the fine, I'm sorry, we'll move on. Or they can contest it in court, civil court. And so we do think that it makes a lot of sense to have this two-step process in place. Many other localities do it, and the enforcement mechanism is easier to deploy. Another big area here is the site plans. And I've never liked how the site plan ordinance is set up here. And the expectation, and I don't think this is cleaned up quite yet, the expectation that, or question of when does a site plan get done? And so if I apply for a special exception for a brewery, whatever, do I have to do my full engineered plan as part of my application to see whether I'm even allowed to do this use? Or do I find out that I'm going to be granted a special exception, I can do this use on this parcel, now I have to do my engineered drawings? And those drawings, that could be $20,000, $30,000. So when does somebody have to make that investment? And if it's not at the time of special exception, then you need something at that time to tell the board and the community what's happening there, but does it have to be an engineered plan? So that's where this concept of a major and a minor site plan have entered into this draft of, and they haven't parsed out what should be in each category, but should there be kind of a site plan light for certain scenarios and levels of development, and then a full-blown thing in other scenarios? And I think that makes a lot of sense, particularly in our community where we just don't do much heavy commercial stuff. And why make somebody do everything you need for a new commercial bank for a little thing at the special exception stage before they even know if they're going to be allowed to do the use there? Those are really the main big changes. I just finished today going through all of the new sections in pretty good detail, and developed a lot of comments that I'll send back to Berkeley Group, but I do want to know, are there other, have you seen things in those drafts? How do you want staff to help you review those? Do you want to go line by line? Do you want to see our feedback and kind of think on it for a period of time and then build on maybe what we picked up? How can we help you get comfortable with understanding what is being proposed to the extent that you feel confident to provide some comment back to the Berkeley Group before we really even get to a point where any of this is anywhere close to ready for a public hearing to seek input from the public? And I think even before that, there's got to be some time for the public to also weigh in on this front end process before Berkeley Group kind of finalizes things and passes it back and has it in some form ready for a public hearing.
Is there a way to cut it up in chunks? I agree with what we heard earlier. It's so big.
So outside, so you've got the 4 articles, Article 1, 2, 3, and 9. That's where there's significant change and they're attached here. Also emailed out to you and some of the public received track changes, which is hard to follow because paragraphs are moving around. There's some new content, but there's things moving around as well. It's hard to track. Other than that, the rest is really just moving around. And this is where all the main changes are. But it is hard when, you have stuff that was in 2 different sections of the code before, now they're in a new chapter and trying to track what came from where. And I had, multiple windows up trying to look back and forth at each one. And I had some difficulty tracking it all out. And if my familiarity with the code, there's no doubt that other people will have difficulty tracking it.
Could we start by doing the required state changes?
So a lot of those some of the state changes that were talked about are the who can do what where.
Right.
If you want to talk, how are we going to do telecommunications? How are we going to do solar or these things? That's not contemplated at all here. This is really just about how do you apply to do those things. So that's a different approach. This approach was let's get comfortable with the Berkeley Group on their ability to rearrange things and make the ordinance, present the ordinance in a way that is easier for people to follow, to understand how to do what they want to do. But let's not let them get into what they're allowed to do quite yet, because we're not sure if we trust them yet. And we want them to earn our trust by doing this part of it.
Right.
I think that's generally the way the conversation went.
Well put.
Yep, okay.
So, yeah, sure you could, but there's things in here that do check off some very important things. Conditional zoning, proper rezonings. You got major gaps right now in your current ordinance, and this tries to tighten those up relative to being accused of forcing unreasonable proffers on somebody and then saying that you did that.
Okay, so phrasing what Van said differently, in the aggregate, we have critical mass of those areas that the Berkeley Group has identified are gaps or potentially risky open space in our ordinance that they've recommended a way to close those areas and that we could address all at once. Or is it that?
They haven't suggested anything beyond this yet. So
Identification.
there are definitely other things that in their diagnostic that they thought were right for to be addressed early. And the conversation was, maybe we need to get comfortable with this part of it and Berkeley Group's ability to do what we ask you to do before we get into the more substantive things that could change where a solar farm can go or not go,
right?
All that stuff.
But even among the changes that are here, we have sort of 2 dimensions of changes. One was the reorganization, the other was those administrative ones. And I think what we're hearing from the public is changing 2 things at the same time makes it particularly hard to follow. But I'm not sure that's the worst alternative, because the alternatives would seem to be change the substantive stuff, add zoning or conditional proper zoning and, fix site plans within the old language and structure, and then reorganize everything.
I think reorganizing at the end is problematic.
Yeah.
I'd rather find a way to reorganize with this little change up front.
Yeah,
If there was a shift, I'd rather do it that way. I think it'd be much easier to follow. But, when it's open, I think there are some things you want to address.
But they gave
on that
us,
plan.
presumably, we think they gave us trust us, we didn't change anything in this version, we just reorganized everything, right?
For the most part, but they've put margin comments or footnotes in areas where they said, this is entirely new language for this reason. Or, this is, you talked about, wanting 2 types of site plans. This is where it would go. We didn't really do it for you yet.
But no, I think, didn't they give us, though, just the pure, your ordinance reorganized part?
No, that's the full one. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, so one step would be to go forward just with that part,
There you
and
go.
then come back with any substantive stuff. I mean, they've given us a platform for considering that.
That's
That seems pretty unambitious to me.
Yeah,
but,
it seemed.
I didn't even look at that.
Yeah,
In
right.
detail.
In theory.
And I guess it would at least give public, if you say, our intent here was no changes other than to make it reorganized and reword, then if anybody finds something that they think is a change, it's a good conversation, it's a catch. But boy, that's a slow march.
Yeah.
Very slow, but that's kind of where I was going, and just trying to figure out like step 1, step 2.
But I think that
It's foundational, non-substantive changes.
it is overwhelming, and I think one of the messages you can say to the public is that you don't intend to cram it down the road and do this as fast as possible, and that this information can be available for, a significant period of time as people gather around it and find its faults or not before you drive along.
Well, this is always the issue with getting consulted. I remember when they gave it to us, they wanted our comments by the end of the month on all of it, right? I mean, is there any?
Well, they work for us.
Yeah, but in terms of our contract and our deal, we're not losing.
No, I don't think so. I mean, our biggest risk is that they become oversubscribed because they're going to set us on the side and go. They have to make money and work for somebody. They're going to work for somebody else and get full in, and then when we're ready to go, they're going to say, "Well,
we got different people.
You're going to have to wait. I'll get to you next month." And so I think that's your biggest risk, really, which is not terrible. It'd be nice to plug some of these holes in case, that one type of project, if it comes along that fits that little gap that you got to resolve, but we don't have those crystal balls.
We had also sent out from the planning commission a list kind of bullet items that we wanted, requested feedback from the board of supervisors on our way forward. And I think we reviewed that in October. I didn't see that attached to the agenda tonight.
Well, there was no output from that meeting, and it was talked about at the board level. I don't think there was any actual action.
I mean, I think it was, one was the proffers, one was if we are inclined or not to include any additional family divisions. I can't remember what all the other ones were, but it was things that we kind of, and whether or not we would be interested in seeking civil penalties.
Michelle printed it out. I can read it if you want.
Yeah, it's things we bandy about, but.
So the first is not. It's not the administration, right? It came up during that planning commission meeting, which was family division rights and whether there's a way to expand that. And is that resetting the date or changing from 5 to 6, 6 to 7 or whatever, how many divisions you're allowed. And a family division basically gives you, it allows you to ignore the density requirement and have a real crappy road. That's what you get out of family division. So you can allow more of that by changing the ordinance if you want to do that. Because it's a lot more affordable. Civil penalties, whether you want to add those or not, strong recommendation from staff, including county attorney. Whether to split the site plan into major and minor. whether individuals should be able to request a zoning text amendment, or those should have to come as a recommendation through. We allow them today in our current ordinance, and they've happened a couple times. It can be awkward, and what happened before was, the May amendments were taking like 5 years. But somebody applies for a text amendment and they're straight to the front of the line because there are time metrics involved there. So one would say, well, why are we dealing with this? We haven't even finished the May amendments yet. It's because somebody paid money to apply. And so you have to do that. So do you want to allow that? You don't have to allow that. You can allow that and say, we're only going to take these up in July of every year. So get your applications in, we'll put them in a pile, and in July we're going to do them to see how they fit together. You can. People do it a lot of
You mean
different
when
ways.
everybody's on vacation?
Or I was just thinking, not write it in,
Get out of budget season.
Yeah.
Think about it.
Please.
And then the question on the time limit for special exceptions, which we have staked our claim to in our current code in 17054, and my comment so far back to the Berkeley group is we will absolutely keep that in our ordinance, and if some court wants to tell us we can't do it in the future, let them do that. I think it is a very reasonable, where you're allowed to include a zoning ordinance with reasonable conditions and regulations. The state has already shown that they think it's perfectly fine for BZAs to do that, because they wrote it specifically in that section. And they also said that boards can reserve those rights onto themselves. So I don't think it's a huge leap to say that boards can do it too. But some in the state think maybe it's a debatable topic, and Berkeley Group is in that group, and I think our direction to them should be, we'll keep doing what we've been doing, and we'll put time limits on our special exceptions.
Didn't we just kind of reaffirm that?
Yeah,
Tourist home?
absolutely did.
Yeah.
Right. And then having a better understanding conditional zoning process and why that's important, and if you need more information on that, we can do that. It's really it's not super complicated in the ordinance, just what you have now doesn't protect you after some state language changes that happen around 2020, maybe earlier than that. So maybe it's 2017. Where the burden really shifted because in the big home markets, the developers were really screaming about ridiculous cash proffers, ridiculous requirements for off-site proffers, where localities were really turning the screws on the development community, and they're saying, listen, we can't, this is crazy. And so the General Assembly totally turned things around and said, if counties put unreasonable proffers on it, enforce it on you, then they'll just grant you, they'll just push you out of the way, and you'll be forced to grant the permit through some court. But now everybody kind of got away from that by putting work into their ordinance to basically say, applicant, you're going to put in writing that we didn't force you to do any unreasonable proffers. This is a little dance, that happened. But it was a chilling effect on development because for a while, localities just stopped. Said, okay, if you're going to accuse us of doing unreasonable proffers, we're just not going to allow any development. None.
So the civil penalty one seems like it would be an easy discussion and move forward or not.
Yeah, I think that's pretty simple.
The
There's
site plan is pretty simple, I thought, too.
Well, there's some work that needs to go into what that division is and how that's lined out. But I think it makes a lot of sense. Not all development projects are equally intensive or impactful on their neighbors and traffic and things, and you might not need the same level of detail for all. And I think it wouldn't be too hard to take your use matrix and instead of having an X in the column for site plan, have not an M and an M, but whatever. Something for major and minor, a 1 and a 2, or A and B.
Well, isn't that, we just went through this with the Blue Rock property with the concept plan where we went back. Is the concept plan a construct of our imagination?
So you have, right now, you have the opportunity to waive portions of a site plan. If it's administrative, then Michelle has the authority. If it requires public hearings for special exceptions, then the Planning Commission has that authority. So you can not require a full site plan.
So that's what we did there, where that was just just a conversation.
And then it talks about having a sketch, if you don't have a site plan, then you need to at least have these minimum lists. I think all of that needs to be reframed and be much more clear.
Yeah.
Who has to do what when.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry, I spoke up because I think this was what we asked the supervisor, so I shouldn't be answering our own question. But
So to your point, Gary, right now we require for a tent campsite a site plan, but we also require it for a landfill. So it's really different.
Yeah, totally different.
And that's to your point, it
Yeah.
could just be.
Yeah, I mean, if
And so that could just be, you were saying, just go down through the table and just say, yep, 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 and make a judgment.
And it
call.
might both be an engineered plan, I don't know. And then some don't need a site plan at all. There might be a situation where a primitive tent site later down the road where, like the one we had, was it Crest Hill, where they had 2 little fire pits. Before you even apply, please go find an engineer to draw this up, and that's ridiculous. You can take the plat, draw a couple X's on it, say this is where you're gonna be, and that's probably enough for you to decide whether it's impactful to the neighbors or not.
Wonder how that campground is going.
Yeah, probably pretty well, they were pretty busy before they got the permit, so.
There's that.
Would you want to vote on them individually? What would you?
I don't think there's a need to necessarily vote, but if there's a strong feeling from the board that we should have interim feedback back to the Berkeley group, that, you know, definitely we're not doing this, like the time thing, I feel like there's pretty good consensus that we're going to, as Ms. Smith has said, we're going to claim the middle ground for ourselves, right? And so we're going to keep doing the time limit because we think that's appropriate and we're going to do it.
Yep.
You know, and if there's a similar feeling about civil penalties, that we should at least include that in the draft that goes to the public hearing.
Absolutely.
Public can speak out, but most public would probably want this, so they're not dragged into criminal court for something that could be relatively minor. But if basically what it says is, if your fines get over $5,000, you've matriculated to criminal process, and so it's basically what we have now. And I think we talked about the site plan. I don't think I've heard much consensus on the zoning text amendments. We don't get a lot of them, it's not too onerous, but it was an open question on whether you wanted to do it or not.
I think your point about doing it once a year is probably reasonable. I mean, has it been exercised in anybody's recent memory?
Yeah.
We had like 2, I think.
We had the golf driving range.
Which failed, because the language that they asked for was, it didn't make, it couldn't work that way, right? But that was enough to go through and fail, and then I think the board and the planning commission said, well, if you put all these restrictions on it, then it might make sense. But the person who asked for the text amendment didn't think to put all those restrictions on it.
Yes,
So in a lot of cases, it just makes more sense for the person to go to their planning commissioner and say, you know, I'd really like to figure out a way to do this.
Yep.
And then a planning commissioner introduces it to the planning commissioner, saying, well, there's people out there that want to do this thing. And then everybody around the table says, that's a great point, I never thought about that. How can we put together an amendment that would make sense? Planning commission passes a resolution and starts the process.
See, to me, that was always how I would prefer it to work.
Seems logical.
I agree, and it's just like, it's virtually a moot point. I mean, it almost never
They know
happens.
it's never happened.
So, in the name of simplifying our ordinance, it's one small step for some simplification, I think. So we're talking about the bifurcated site plan thing. We're talking about civil penalties, no citizen-driven text amendments.
And continue our time limits on special exceptions.
Is that all of them then?
Yeah, the other one was just understand the importance of the conditional zoning.
Okay.
What time limit? Is it the 120 days or?
What's that?
What's the time limit on special exception?
Will expire on sale.
Oh, yeah, it's the assumption of authority that allows us to say it expires.
Oh.
transfer.
Or there's
Yeah.
for a certain number of years,
I
it
see.
expires
Yeah,
after a certain number of
I got you.
years.
I
that-
thought-
Having the duration as a condition of the permit.
As
Okay.
opposed
More
to a vested
appropriately
right
said.
that you can't.
Got it.
And if there's consensus, I'm fun moving forward, because there's no action being taken until, someday down the line, there's gonna be something, public hearing document, and so there's general consensus on what feedback to Berkeley Group should be, to get us one step closer to eventually having a document ready to go to the public.
Well, I think this just further complicates the reorganization plus.
Well, this is the administrative side, right?
Oh, these are the
Yeah.
pieces of.
Yeah, the enforcement and administration. And so when we have a process to rezone a parcel or to have somebody apply for a special exception, do you have a defensible process? So at the end of the day, when you make a decision that a use is appropriate or not, do you have a process that is more likely to stand up in court by making some of these changes? Not necessarily whether a particular use is appropriate on a particular property, that's for a future phase.
Right, but are these all Article 2, or would these be spread across?
These are 1, 2, 3, and 9. All those.
This is all of
Yeah.
the things in there.
And the site plan is most of Article 3, which that all is a lot of work.
So this is just further articulation of what we were talking about before in terms of the specific changes that they've made that were substantive to 1, 2, 3, and 9.
We're saying consensus is going to, and we should move at it.
So let me just talk 1 second about this text amendments here. Fauquier County has a very detailed zoning ordinance, and over the years, they have closed up every loophole, double knitted it and crossed it and everything. And I'm amazed that every 2 or 3 months, there'll be a public advertisement for a half dozen text amendments for particular things that were not addressed in the ordinance.
Wow.
And it's been going on for years. And so what we're saying is that it can't be any citizen-driven submission, so that they have to get a member of the board to champion their presentation to get it done.
The introduction of
Yeah, so if it has a little bit of a negative PR to it or whatever, nobody's gonna carry it or suggest it. Is that fair? I don't know.
It might save them an application fee if it's
Well,
a
I mean,
negative
but-
PR connotation, because it
but, I
might
mean,
not just.
Getting past the fee part of it, is that giving them really a due process and ability to be heard?
Well, I mean, there's no avenue for a citizen to recommend a change to the tax code in Rappahannock County, or at the state level, or at the federal level. I mean, you have to go to your representative. And zoning is a very interesting spot where, people depending on the locality, and here have had the opportunity, I'm going to pay a fee that gives me the right to put forward my idea. They might not be very good at crafting language, but they can do it.
They can be heard.
They can be heard. Now, they can't do it because they want to change the tax code or any one of the fireworks code or any of the other sections of code in the county code. They can only do it for this. And is it appropriate or not? Or should it be vetted by, the bodies charged with sorting that stuff out first? And maybe improve it, which is what happened with the limited golf driving range change, which, improved on the concept.
That got improved because they submitted it.
But they could have easily have gone to somebody and said, hey.
They have to have found somebody to.
Well, couldn't they also
It'd be
just
fee
show
free
up
if they
in
go
a
through
public
us.
comment?
Yeah, they go to public comment.
Someone will show up in public comment and say, I think we ought to change this, here's my proposed language.
putting it on one.
Take it off.
Like-
You're not putting it on one, but you're not assuming some right beyond
They
that.
could
by
get,
any other
100 of their closest friends and sign a petition and say, there's a groundswell of support for this change.
You're just not jumping to the front of the line. Yeah, so I think, thinking about it, it's probably less likely that they would find a sponsor on the commission, and more likely that they would show up at a meeting with or without whatever arguments they'd make about proposing the change, and then it would be up to the body to sort of decide.
Most of our citizens aren't bashful, they would go to all of the planning commissioners and all the board members and explain why this change makes a lot of sense, and probably the board members say, you know what, you're right, or,
At least
you know,
take it, at least talk about it.
I know you just moved here 6 months ago, but this is a different community than we do.
But Mr. Henry's point about lack of due process, presumably that would be of a concern to some citizens during the public hearing process once the zoning ordinance change was put into a public hearing, right? So we could go out and say, we are proposing to eliminate from our zoning ordinance the current citizen-driven ordinance
Yes.
change avenue, and then people could come and say, well, hey, that's not right. And then we could choose to not do it.
In all fairness to the community, that is noted before, there's a lot of stuff here.
I know,
So
it
to
could
craft
be-
a notice that explains precisely all the things that change and the requirements on what we have to say have changed. We don't have to have a description anymore, we just have to say where to go look at it. But we would rely on, you know, our press partners and maybe pick out the main points to help the citizens key in on it.
Well, it's a good due process question. Maybe we set that one aside for now. I don't know. And it's, now looking at it another way, it doesn't happen that often here.
It doesn't.
Certainly not every few months, like you're describing, so maybe it's,
I think it's twice in 6 years.
it's probably much ado about nothing then.
You know, it's good to have the ability for people to express themselves, because you never know what goes along with that person that expresses themselves. You know, if they have to be a different nationality or ethnic, whatever, you know, if you're denied an opportunity to do something, to be heard,
Okay.
you know, it's just a little.
Well, let's leave, I'm okay leaving that one alone for now. It's not a big
great.
deal.
I mean, as long as we, you know, it will only probably come up if we have a complicated process to go through, you know, it'll probably come up. I remember one time, many years ago, we had a public hearing on Chester Gap because somebody was doing a sewer system that was discharging fluid into a ditch up there. And our ordinance didn't allow that. And it was a big, you know, it was allowed every place in the state, but it wasn't allowed in that county. Because we had something in our ordinance that said we couldn't do that.
I wonder if we could take the middle road then and just cut them back to once a year to do the text amendments, instead of allowing them at any time. Just so, if we allow them once in a year, and it's on the books, it's fair for everybody, someone submits it early, gives it a chance to get air, and for people to see which way the wind's blowing. And most importantly to me, I mean, we don't have a large staff, and if it sort of directs the effort to a certain time of year where that staff has just unloaded the budget cycle and knows that that's the time that that's anticipated to happen, that's something we can move through at that time that doesn't detract from anything else.
So you're working on, here's the other side of that, you're working on, that's probably going to entail a site plan. So you're working on a project and you're working on getting a site plan approved, project approved. So if you submitted it in February, you're working on your project and your hearing date is September, October, your annual date, then that person's gonna, the applicant's gonna have to wait 6 months to move forward their application?
So you mean, this is a scenario where somebody wants to do, have a particular use on a parcel that is not allowed because the road's not the right shape or the parcel's not the right size or something, and they want to change the rules to say that the parcel can be different.
Well, it's like our golf course example, because that's one of the two that we can recall.
Yeah.
It was associated with.
The other one's, you know, a small professional business, and when you have 3 or 4 is some magical number, and that got pulled before it ever went anywhere.
Yeah, that's the thing is, I mean, I know staff spent time researching that and putting it all together, and then before it even came to fruition, it was in the dustbin.
Well, there's another way of looking at it too, which is that since we don't get a lot of them, we always reserve the right to change it.
Yeah, you can change your ordinance
So
anytime
if-
through a couple public hearings.
I mean, I agree with what Mr. Henry is saying here in the sense that democratic engagement to me is really highly valued, and I know it's a little odd because, you know, I cannot introduce a bill into Congress. I gotta get a sponsor, right? And so I get that. But on a local level, I think it's meaningful to people to be able to do that. Now, how many people in our county even know that they can do that? I have no idea. But I do think it's a good thing. So we could just approach it that way and just say, hey, you know, if we start getting a whole, if it's like this.
Floodgates open.
Yeah, if it's an activist sort of thing, which all of a sudden we get bound up, to your point, we'll just shut it down. We'll just change the ordinance.
I mean, we're trying to make the ordinance user-friendly, so
Yeah.
this goes along with being user-friendly.
So have you come to a consensus?
I would say it's legal.
Go along.
Okay. No, scratch it out. No, I did. That's good. Good conversation. So, at least on these main points, we'll wrap that into comments to send back. I know you all love to dive into code, and if you have specific thoughts on anything else, that would be wonderful. And I will share, when I reviewed it, I just made margin comments, and I can make those available to you and the public. Just different things that I thought needed to be addressed, and I'll adjust those based on this conversation if they need to be adjusted. And then we can build on it from there.
Great.
I can get something back to the Berkeley group and tell them to temper their expectations.
To
on
Mr.
time.
Light's question here is that like, what, I don't want to say we can take our time with this, but we can take our time with this.
We need to take the amount of time that's appropriate.
And my question to you then is that when he asked that question, you said we don't want to get kicked to the gutter. We have months to deal with this.
I think Berkeley Group has an idea. They want to march through it. They don't want.
Sure.
They feel like they're probably failing to some extent if we're wallowing, and they want to keep moving us forward, right, without just stalling. But there's a balance.
Okay.
And we'll make sure we have that conversation with them. And if they tell us, look, we're 100% booked up for the month of X, Y, and Z, then we'll have to say, okay, I understand. And that means we're going to have to plan around that, or get done before then, or whatever.
I think we may be different from other places in that there is a lot of citizen involvement and interest in what we do, and that is a wonderful thing. And at the end of the day, I want us to come to a place where we have something that's a finished product that we can all agree is something we can adopt. So if it takes us a little longer than other localities, so be it.
Yeah, we're supposed to be making improvements, so if we do something other than that, we're wasting a lot of time.
Yes.
I'm just sort of thinking about cost and consultants.
Yeah, well, which means they need to be paused rather than working.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, there are other inherent risks, staff turnover, they forget, they have to come back.
Sure, yeah.
Rates go up over years. I mean, these things all happen.
Yeah.
They seem to have a lot of staff turnover, or staff moving up, and then they're not
Yeah,
on the
it's
project
tricky.
anymore, which is really unfortunate.
All right. I think that's all I really wanted to get out of this agenda item.
Pretty good.
You heard a lot from the public.
We should do this more often.
Didn't we do this last Thanksgiving?
Cranberry sauce.
Yeah, you're right.
A little laughter in there. Michelle's looking for hers.
Oh, that's great.
All right.
So I think the board could probably adjourn if you will.
I think I missed the last one, actually.
Motion.
I'll second.
And a motion and a second, any discussion?
We're just gonna have some, our board.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. Thank you. Any opposed? All right.
And then, planning commission had no new business, no old business. You had your general list of stuff.
Yep.
And then a roundtable discussion apparently.
Well,
I think we covered that.
I think so.
happy Thanksgiving.
Yes. So, did anyone have anything for roundtable discussion? How does everyone feel about work sessions? Should we look to the new year? I know this is not a great time for work sessions typically.
Whatever's needed.
And I don't want to speak on behalf of you or any of my other members, colleagues on board supervisors, but we could do this again. I think it's quite productive if the stars align and there's enough material for us to address simultaneously. I think it's efficient.
So what is the next horizon that we would want to work? Is it going back to the annotated Berkeley comments? Is that what we were thinking?
What would be the next measure if we're gonna take up the Berkeley report? What's the best way to dole that out for us to
I think
discuss?
what, I'll share, I'll edit what I've done so far based on what I've heard. I'll share that out to everybody. And then I think maybe take that and add to it individually. And then you'll want to have some consensus on what you think is your group position on the various points.
So it's, again,
Yeah.
sort of the entirety of the set of things.
I think focusing on these 4 articles where the majority of the changes are, where you really need to be. Then how it all plugs into the big picture would be kind of next.
1, 2, 3, 9.
Yeah. So it might make sense for a joint meeting when after you think about all those things and that next step, or maybe the planning commission just does that and then passes it up to the board.
How quickly do you think you can get it out to us? I mean, how far in advance? I mean, I feel like we need to.
So I mean, I've already gone through them all. I just need to make a couple edits from tonight. I can get that out by Friday.
Okay. That sounds good. Is there any further discussion this evening? We have a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
A second?
Second.
Thank you. All in favor? Aye. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.